On today's video, we are introducing you to a very unique creature. It has evolved in the wild, unfettered by predation, by any kind of intervention from mankind. It is untouched since it first evolved millions of years ago. And all that remains is a single skull. It might not look like a particularly vicious predator, but the assassin kitty was known for its voracious appetite and for its ability to take down prey far larger than its mere 35 centimeters might have indicated it capable of doing so. We're going to explore the assassin cat, as they were called, in greater depth as they go through their various life cycles of summer, winter, autumn, and spring, the killing time. This is the assassin kitty. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Campaign Creator Series. My name is Guy and today we are indeed looking at the Assassin Kitty. This of course is a replica of a skull of a saber-toothed tiger, a cat that existed several thousand years ago during the Ice Age and was known for its particularly long dagger or saber-shaped teeth. Now, this is probably the size of what a very young saber-tooth would have looked like just after birth, as a matter of fact. Probably without the teeth, these kind of would grow in later. The real saber-toothed tiger was slightly larger than an actual tiger, which would have made the skull much, much bigger, and the cat itself being a little bit more terrifying. However, the idea of a saber kitty, let me remove the lower jaw there. If we look at those teeth, if I were to place them against my own flesh, they would be able to puncture all the way through to the carotid or to the jugular without any sort of issues whatsoever. They could, maybe not through the chest area. I do have a lot of padding. It is anti-assassin kitty protection, but if they were to strike with enough power, it could quite easily puncture through an eyeball into the brain, definitely through the throat. So a little cute cat suddenly becomes incredibly dangerous and incredibly powerful. Why are we talking about assassin kitty cats apart from the fact that I would love to have one? When we are talking about home brewing in our campaign creation series, and that's exactly what we are doing, we looked last week at how to create a race that was going to fit within your world. We now need to look at monsters, because frequently monsters, although most books have got tons and tons and tons of information on monsters, they sometimes don't have monsters that work specifically for our campaign setting. So how do we deal with that? Well, we make our own. As we did before with the race that we were creating, for our players to play. With monsters, it's a slightly different question that we're asking. We're still going to turn to World Anvil. They are our content creator of choice in this particular instance because they have this block. Now, we're working with Dungeons & Dragons in this particular case simply because it's so universal, but they have stat blocks for a lot of different role-playing systems, and you can request stat blocks for more. So they actually have a block here just for monsters. Now, when we go through to the monsters, we can see their new Heroes interface that they've launched recently. That's for player characters as well as for GMs and DMs to run their games and things. But we have now got this rather interesting character race. Let me get this one right. Monster template that we can start to fill in. And as you can see, it's far more comprehensive than the race that we were creating. Why is that? Well, generally the race template that you are going to be using is in conjunction with race template, class or profession template, background template. So the race is a component of the entire character. In the case of creating a monster, the monster needs to have all of those abilities built in. And so that's exactly what we're going to have to fill in here. Now, again, they've drawn from the existing Dungeons & Dragons template, so we can literally just fill it in as we go along. I'm not going to talk you through how do we create a race, how do we create a monster specifically in terms of working out what their challenge ratings are, in terms of working out their powers and their abilities are. That's not the purview of the video. Today the video is simply looking at what must we consider when we are creating our own races. Now, when we look at our campaign setting, when we look at Eutherios, at the world of Gaia, we've got a few things that we can add in terms of races. But do we need to, simply because we can? Well, it's a good question, and it's one that I think we need to really sort of dig deep down into. So how are we going to do that? Well, when we look at the races that we're going to need, traditionally, we look at the Greek monsters that we have. Do we have hydras? Yes, we do. Do we have Medusa? Yes, we do. Do we have harpies? Yes, we do. They already exist. There's no point in reinventing the wheel unless you want to push them a step further. When you look at hydra, when you look at harpies, when you look at the traditional Greek-inspired and earlier culture-inspired monsters, you go, okay, cool, they sit for a specific level, they sit for a specific difficulty challenge for my players and the like, but can I push them a step further? What would happen if they evolved? If there are harpies and the harpies have formed a colony, do the harpies change? Do we want some Stygian witches to come on board? Are there snake folk that we can add in? Now, I created snake folk specifically, not Yuan-Ti. Yuan-Ti are a very interesting race within the existing monsters manual, but I wanted a snake race that wasn't as powerful as the Yuan-Ti, and that didn't have the shape-changing abilities that came with that particular race. I wanted my snake folk to be almost more like lizard folk, but more reptilian in nature. So there is an example of why would you add a race in. Now, we also need to unpack what are they going to be doing within your setting. So if you're going to be adding in the mosquito, for example, as a monster, is it going to be used more than once? And if it is going to be used more than once, why? How do they get involved? How do they present themselves? What are they doing within your space? Why haven't they been hunted to extinction? Do all those kinds of questions start to come through? And those are the interesting narrative questions that we have to ask ourselves. So let's say, for example, we wanted to introduce I'm trying to think of a monster now offhand, which I can't think of, that exists in the Monsters Manual already, and that works within the context of this game. What about the brain slug thing that we're using for our nemesis? It's not a full slard, it's a slug version of the slard, which is not exactly in the Monsters Manual. What if there were more of these things, these sort of symbiotic leeches that existed? Well, perhaps we could call it a slard leech, so that there is the connection with the slardy that are going to be helping Jakar take over the world, but perhaps these slug-like creatures need to be specced out, because if we're going to use them more than once, then that's great. And, quite frankly, I think it's something that we are going to need throughout our game because, well, the slardy slug is quite terrifying. What I'd also sort of contemplate in terms of them is that they don't have a culture. They are these things that are inserted into the spaces so that, you know, they infiltrate, they take control, they infest counselors and things. That's part of our bigger plan as well, replacing counselors and things with the slardy doppelgangers and the like. Well, perhaps the slard slugs go in first, introduce themselves into the hosts, learn everything, and then they can sort of disgorge that information out to the slardy who consume the slug. Perhaps that's the life cycle of a slug. It gets consumed, the knowledge it has gets passed on to the slardy, and that gives us an interesting cycle. That also means that any player characters who deign to consume one of these slugs, and we're going to make them slimy and nasty and just really horrid, will then also gain the knowledge that comes with that. So I think that could be particularly exciting. I do kind of like the idea of the assassin kitty. I must admit, I was part of a group that wrote a book called Monsters of the Guild for the DM DM's Guild of Wizards of the Coast, and in that I had another type of cat-like race, the Mantis, which had 6 legs and a spidery kind of body, but a cat-like head, and it would wander around and it would explode, basically. Very easy to kill, just it would explode, but the white liquid that it covered you in was basically like a permanent wizard's mark. So assassin who controlled the cat could then follow you wherever you went, regardless of which plane you went to as well. So cats. I think cats are really cool. I think adding in an assassin kitty could be quite fun, especially if the assassin cats are part of the royal household. So they're not evil. Well, they're just cats that get trained to go out. They just evolve these particularly large teeth because the rats, perhaps, that they're hunting have particularly thick skin. There's another question. So with the Slard slug, I'm just trying to put his jaw back in place. There we go. So with the Slard slug, we could quite easily see this thing as being a creation. It is a force of magic pulling it together, creating it, designing it specifically to go and get information out of our targets. With the assassin cat, it could simply be a feral cat that evolved, but because its prey had particularly large or thick skin, the armadillo, for example, maybe it was a pangolin hunter. Who knows what it evolved for? Well, you can know because you're creating the thing. But as you create it, well, now let's look at how did it evolve, how did it happen. So it was a pangolin hunter or an armadillo hunter, and those massive teeth were required to punch through the armor plating of its prey. That then gets captured, the humans domesticate it, as they did with cats, if you can call them domesticated, and then started to realize that they have applications in terms of military use. They can be turned into assassins. They can be turned into quite effective personal bodyguards as well. I can imagine the rulers of the Sagetti Empire in my Windswift game having these assassin cats prowling around with their massive saber-like teeth with little gold bangles and trinkets adorning them, or adorning them, bedecking them, I suppose, adorning them, whatever you want, whatever phrase you want. I think that could be visually quite impactful and can create quite a dynamic world. So however you then go about it, when you start to fill in these things, and let's just go back to this template very quickly, when you then start to go through these sort of things, that should be in the back of your mind already before you start to create the race. The reason why, look at suggested environments. So for the Slard, or the slug, I should say, the suggested environment would be the plains where the slard are coming from. Would it be a vat of goo? Do they sort of get transported in barrels of goo so that they don't dehydrate and then they get dropped Tau Ceti Alpha 5 slug style from Star Trek Wrath of Khan? Are they tiny? We haven't really worked out how big they need to be. The one on Jakar is huge, but that's because she's huge. Maybe it's the progenitor of all of these. Maybe it's the thing that creates these little slardy slug things. With the cats, the suggested environments could be that they evolved in desert-like environments, hunting these heavily armored creatures, or jungle-like environments. The armor class is going to be determined by whether this thing has natural predators. Slardy slugs probably don't have natural predators. They're probably these soft, fleshy-bodied things, and because they need to inveigle their way into their host, probably, I would say, through the ear or through the navel, which is always particularly terrifying. If they need to get in through there, they're probably not going to have a huge or very high armor class. The cats, on the other hand, because they are predators, they're going to be fighting their prey. Maybe they're like meerkats who take on mongooses, who take on cobras and snakes and things. They've got incredibly good reflexes. So maybe their armor class is quite high. But the cats won't have a very high hit point value. These are not tigers and lions. These are simple little house cats, which are fairly fragile. So then it starts to determine the kinds of values that we're going to put in terms of their strength and things like that, their movement. The slardy slugs can't fly, but they can burrow perhaps into the ground where they remain, or they can climb walls so they can drop down onto their prey. The cats might have a climb speed. They've got little claws. They're pretty good at climbing. They won't have a swim speed, and they certainly won't have a flying speed. What senses do they have? Again, by answering our questions originally, when it comes to filling in these templates, and these templates are important for us to realize, these are the mechanics of the game. So when we're starting to add in our own races, we have to make sure that mechanically the race is fitting and ticking all of the boxes. As we go through these, those boxes are informed by the narrative that we have created around the race itself. So again, having a little bit of knowledge and working through this from that perspective allows you to create a very strong narrative. At the same time, you then see a prompt saying, well, do they have a spell casting ability? I don't think the cats do. The cats are not any kind of mysterious being. They are creatures that evolved naturally. On the other hand, the slug, they might very well have an ability, a spellcasting ability such as numb pain or something. You don't have to create a new spell for this, but you can go through the spells available to you in whatever system that you're using and then say, okay, well, they have the ability to anesthetize the area around which they're penetrating. Most parasites have that. Mosquitoes have that to a certain degree. Ticks have definitely got it. Fleas have got it. Leeches have got it. The ability to anesthetize the local area so that the victim doesn't feel their insertion of their bodies into themselves, into their victims. The victims don't feel that. So it's important that we realize that these can work both ways. We go, well, spellcasting could work. Okay, great, let's add that in. Then we look at the actions that they can take, of course, and we can build that up however we like. Reactions, legendary actions in Dungeons and Dragons anyway, none of these would be on that par. Layer actions, regional effects, and then of course we can add in an image just to round out the whole thing. So the template, although it might seem fairly daunting, is a logical step, which each step is going to prompt you and promote you in terms of thinking outside of the box, in this particular case, because you're filling in the box. But it should act as a guide. Where do you start, though? You start off by asking, do I need a new monster species? Do I need to add this to my game? If the answer is yes, then you go ahead and add it. Where does inspiration come from for you to even get to that point? Well, by having cool stuff around you. If I look at this little skull here, it's an eraser. I will never use this to erase a pencil, ever. Ever. However, because it's so detailed, I mean, it's a beautiful, beautiful replica of this skull of a saber-toothed tiger. But when you look at it, you go, well, a little creature like this is probably the size of a small house cat. But those teeth could be painful, and so there's your inspiration. It could be something that you've just picked up, something that you see, something you hear, anything that can inspire you. Ask yourselves these questions. Can you add it to your game? Does it add flavor? Does it add interest? Does it add something that makes it feel more like your world rather than a prescribed world? If the answer is yes, then go through these steps. These things are here for a reason. These templates are magnificent in terms of prompting you, and yeah, go ahead and add your own races. It is an exciting space to be in when you are world creating. Don't go mad and create a whole new bestiary simply because you can. On the other hand, adding in one or two things is pretty awesome. Until next time, I wish you and yours the happiest of monster creating. And all I have to say to you is, light up the forge. This creature is known as a tribble, and it is a voracious consumer of grain. It is also prolific in terms of reproduction, and although we might like them for the sounds that they make and for the sensation of petting and having a tribble available to calm one's nerves, we must remember to never subscribe to the idea of allowing these little buggers to get anywhere near our grain silos, for otherwise the Klingons will arrive and decimate us all. And that is a warning bell that we don't want.